Well, this week I went through a battery of tests to determine if I need a root canal. My tooth has been acting like many people's car problems. You know that kind of car where it makes that noise and then you take it into the mechanic and then it doesn't make that noise any longer? Well, that's been my tooth this week. I mean, it's been just throbbing with pain and I'm like, oh! And so I go into the dentist and they test it and they do all this and nope, don't see anything wrong. And then I leave and then it's like a week later and it's like, oh man, the pain in my mouth. And so I go back into the dentist and so this past week, she went through 5 different tests on this tooth. She knocked on the tooth with an instrument. She's sitting there pounding on my tooth and like, feel any pain? I'm like, no. Then she sprayed air on it and I was like, whoa, that's sensitive, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, she sprayed my tooth with air. Then she did that heat-cold connectivity test, you know? And so she put cold on my tooth and she put heat on my tooth and I'm like, yeah, I feel that. She did x-rays. The final test I've never had happen before though. I knew I was in trouble when she took a ground wire and hung it from the corner of my mouth, but she put electrical current into my tooth to determine whether or not I needed a root canal. You would think that test would work, wouldn't you? No, I'm one of those stubborn types, right? I'm one of those types. She's like, well, I'm not so sure whether you need a root canal yet or not. And so, there's all these tests, but she did not have a definitive test that said, yes, you need a root canal, or no, you don't need a root canal. And hopefully here in a couple of weeks, I'm being sent to a specialist that can do this cone x-ray that will tell you definitively whether or not you need a root canal. But that's what we're talking about here this morning. We're talking about a definitive test. In this world, people wonder about the genuineness of love in many ways. Well, does he love me? Does she love me? We have all these kind of tests that we try to determine whether or not he loves me or she loves me or he loves me not, she loves me. We get into all these types of things, and I'm not going to go through all those tests that people use. But I do want you to know that there is a definitive test for determining genuine love. Jesus tested the rich young ruler once and showing him what he genuinely loved. This is Matthew 19, verses 16 through 30. Now someone came up to him and said, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to gain eternal life?" He said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There's only one who is good, but if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." "Well, which ones?" he asked. Jesus replied, "Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, honor your father and mother, and love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "I wholeheartedly obeyed all these laws. But what do I still lack?" Jesus said to him, "If you wish to be complete, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." But when the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, because he was very rich. In testing for genuine love, it's obvious in this account the man loved money more than God. He loved possessions more than God. And too often, people are deceived or confused regarding their love for God. They say they love God. They're like Peter. "Do you love me?" "You know that I love you." They say that they love him. But what did Peter just do prior to that? He denied Jesus. And so often we say, "I love you, Lord," but then our actions don't match up with what we say love is. We think we love God until God tests their life to see if it's genuine love. Now, maybe your finances, like in this case and what we're talking about in the letter of the 2 Corinthians, maybe it's your health, but ultimately, it's a question about God's provisions. So let's jump into our text today so that we might learn how to take, complete, and understand God's testing for genuine love. Open your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We'll be looking at verses 8 through 15 this morning. Testing for genuine love. This is verse 8. I'm not saying this as a command, but I'm testing the genuineness of your love by comparison with the eagerness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that although he was rich, he became poor for your sakes, so that you by his poverty could become rich. So here's my opinion on this matter. It is to your advantage, since you made a good start last year, both in your giving and your desire to give, to finish what you started. So that just as you wanted to do it eagerly, you can also complete it according to your means. For if the eagerness is present, the gift itself is acceptable according to whatever one has, not according to what one does not have. For I do not say this so there would be relief for others and suffering for you, but as a matter of equality. At the present time, your abundance will meet their need, so that one day their abundance may also meet your need. And thus there may be equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. And so in testing people, God does not give trick questions, nor does he hide the answers. But he gives us a study guide for us all to follow. And the first point we're going to see this morning is taking the test of love, verses 8 and 9. Taking the test of love. My first question is, well, what is this? If we're reading this text, we're wanting to understand, what is he talking about when he says, when he says in the first part, I'm not saying this as a command. So what is the this? If we look back to verses 6 and 7, this is identified as an act of kindness. This is identified as the financial giving, the financial offering for the Jerusalem church, which was lacking. And in verse 7, Paul says, make sure. Now, it's kind of interesting here. It's not communicated as a normal command, but yes, in fact, it very is a command. And so Paul is saying, make sure when it comes to this gift that you are giving as unto the Lord. And so why does he say here in verse 8, I'm not saying this as a command? Kind of strange, isn't it? There's an irony here in how Paul is instructing the Corinthians. I'm giving this command that is not a command. Okay, Paul, I think I understand what you're saying, but I'm not quite sure. And so why? Why is Paul saying that he's giving grammatical construction that it is a command, and then he's saying it's not a command? Well, it goes back to verse 1. It's the gift of God. It's the grace of God. How is grace if it were a command? Paul's point is that the receipt of God's grace should lead to the giving of grace. Grace received should prompt grace given. I can't command you to give because then it wouldn't be by grace that you're making the act and doing the act of obedience. And so therefore, it's not a command. It wouldn't be voluntarily if I command you to do it. And that's what we were talking about last week as far as the gift that they were giving for the church at Jerusalem. That was voluntarily, it was gracious, it was generous, and it was sacrificial. And so Paul's saying, I'm giving you a command, but I'm not giving you a command because it's by the grace of God that you're able to do anything. Paul had the apostolic authority to make it a command. He was unusual from the other people at the beginning of the church. They had apostles leading some of the churches. Apostles had a greater authority than pastors do today. And so he could have said, I'm commanding you to give. But he didn't. You know, as a pastor, occasionally I'm asked, well, how much should I give? That's a dangerous question for a pastor, right? Give everything you got, man. I mean, if we are going to answer in the flesh, it might come out like that at times. But if a pastor is going to respond spiritually, it is in the way and means God has graciously given to you. If we say anything other than that, we are invoking command-like authority on you instead of encouraging you by counsel to give as God has graciously given to you. That's what you heard last week about 10% and not being a command. 10% may or may not be gracious depending on the situation and what you have and how God has treated you. And so we never want to make it a command when it comes to giving. But we want it to be gracious. We want it to be voluntarily. We want it to be generous. We want it to be sacrificial. That's what Paul's saying here. And so your grace giving is really a test of love. It's a test of genuineness in your love. Do you love God and do you love others? Or will you walk away sorrowful because the rich man had much? Every week, year after year, you are taking a test of love. I mean, I was told that once you finish school, there's no more test. But that's not the case, is it? Every single day, you are taking a test. And God knows how to test you appropriately to see if you're fake, if on the outside it looks like you're generous and you're gracious in your giving, when inside you're really kind of hoarding. You're really kind of saying, that's mine versus the Lord's. You've heard over and over that our possessions are not our own. You know that when you die, you will not take them with you. But yet, while we're on earth, we continue to think about how do we build more storehouses for the things that God has given to us, rather than thinking about the community and how to give to those who are in need. And so all of life is a test. It's a test in order to prove, will you be faithful to God? Are you genuine in your heart? Is your giving sacrificially like Jesus's? Now remember, these test results will be revealed. No, we're not going to put a list on the foyer and say who's the top givers for this month. But what did Paul say earlier in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 10? For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be paid back according to what he has done while in the body, whether good or evil. See, we can't just forget what Paul has already taught the church at Corinth. We're collectively learning here. We're progressively learning here what God wants us to do and being faithful and being obedient. And so you better believe, one day we will stand before King Jesus and give an account. He knows whether you are having genuine love for him and for people. You know how? He'll see it in your actions. And one of those actions is giving. I'm glad that God has used and is using spiritual people in my life to influence me towards love and good works. That's what Paul's comparison of the Macedonian churches is here. Paul is not trying to manipulate them or shame the Corinthian church into giving more. It is to provide a positive example. You can be faithful in your response just like the Macedonian church is. Not by how much you give, but in the way you give it. See, we defeat the whole process of grace giving and examining the heart if the comparison was manipulative or was shaming. As parents, we can kind of fall into this temptation from time to time. Why can't you be like your brother or sister? Is that a positive influence? Or is that manipulative and shaming? I know at times I fall into that. Well, why can't you just be more like this? Instead of saying, here's an example. Here's a model. How about we be influenced by them? How about we follow their actions? What did Paul say to the church at Ephesus? Imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so Paul's not using the Macedonian church here in any negative, shaming, or manipulating way. The comparison was a positive influence. But notice, he doesn't just stop with the Macedonian church, does he? What's the text say right after that? Because we know the ultimate example is Christ. And we know our source of grace giving is Christ. Look at verse 9. You know the grace, that's generosity, of our Lord Jesus Christ. That although he was rich, he became poor for your sakes, so that you, by his poverty, could become rich. See, again, you wouldn't be in this position to be gracious if Christ was not first gracious to you. And so what did Jesus give you the potential for? The text says that you might become rich. Now, he's not talking about financial riches here, but it's the idea of growing in enrichment. And it's not economic wealth, it's not economic security, but it's spiritual enrichment. At the church, we kind of fall into the same temptations of the world. He who has the most toys wins, right? That's the paradigm of the world. But what's God's paradigm? Other-centeredness, graciousness, and giving to those who are lacking. That's what spiritual enrichment is. It's better to give than to receive. And so this is what we're celebrating around the communion table this morning. Christ gave himself voluntarily and sacrificially so that we might have life, an abundant life. And so what a gift that God has given. Don't you want to imitate God by giving yourself to others in service and finances? And whatever God has given you, then don't you want to use that for God's glory? We say that, don't we? I'm giving God glory for this. But then at times, when we look at ourselves, we understand, did I really do that for God's glory? Or did I do that for my glory? Did I do that so that my status might look good? Wow, they're really spiritual. Or was I saying it so that it might be deflected up to God? Jesus passed the test of love by being generous, grace-giving. And he's the supreme model for us to follow in our giving. This whole test is what? A test of genuine love. Don't get caught in the behavior of giving. Look at the root of giving. Are you other-centeredness? Are you God-loving, God-fearing, God-gracious in your life? Is that what you're doing? Or are you doing it for some other reason? This is the genuine test of love that Paul is using to inform the Corinthians about giving is not just giving for the sake of giving. It's teaching something deeper here. And the Corinthians, they started out well. But then what happened? The worries and concerns of the world derailed them. And so Paul encourages them in verses 10 through 12 to complete the test. Finish what you start. Here's this, verse 10. So here's my opinion on this matter. It is to your advantage, since you made a good start last year, both in your giving and your desire to give, to finish what you started. So that just as you wanted to do it eagerly, you can complete it according to your means. For the eagerness is present, the gift itself is acceptable, according to whatever one has, not according to what one does not have. And so, finish what you started. Anyone in here ever heard that from their parents before? I mean, I think that's like in Parenting 101, you have to say that to your children at least once time a year. It's like, man, finish what you started. You see all these projects, all these things that get started, and then kids lose interest, and they get diverted, and they go off somewhere, and they're doing all these other things, and we're like, but I thought you liked this. Well, last week I wanted to do that, but now this week I want to do this. And so at times, children's attention spans can go erratically. And so when you hear Paul saying this, that they're going to finish what you've started, this could be taught, again, positively. They were teaching you to persevere during difficult times, but this also can be negatively. Don't be a quitter. I mean, that's what their parents are trying to help you. When they might have come out wrong, give them grace at times when your parents don't say it in quite the exact way that they need to say it. But they're trying to help you to finish what you started, and it can never be done by shame and manipulation, but godly heart change again. And if you really want to finish what you started, then you need to go back to the heart of the matter so that you might complete the matter. That's what Paul's saying here. But again, this is counsel and not command. Paul could have commanded them, but he doesn't. Here is my opinion, the text says. He's not forcing the Corinthian church, but he's teaching why grace giving is the best choice. He says, it's to your advantage. You see that in the text? It's not the thought that really counts. Have you ever heard that? Have you ever kind of scratched your head and said, well, it's the thought that really counts? Well, I don't know about you, but I think the action matters too, doesn't it? It's the thought and action that counts. Not just the thought that counts. Oh, honey, I was going to do the dishes, but then the game came on, so I didn't do the dishes. Well, it's the thought that counts, right? I don't know if that works in Marriage 101. It's the thought and actions. So that's why we bought a dishwasher. No. The goal is to enjoy and reap the fruit of completed action. A farmer cannot just be satisfied in planting the crops. Well, I planted the crops. Right? Satisfaction comes when you harvest the crops. You can't just have it'll be good enough if I just plant. No, you have to finish what you've started. You have to complete the task. It's to a farmer's advantage to harvest the crops. The idea here is it's useful, or it's helpful, or it's beneficial. Listen to this. What is a good intention if there's no action with it? That's what Paul's saying here. You started the test. Now complete the test. And here's the ironic thing. He's using the Macedonian church to influence them to complete the test. But do you know who Paul used to influence the Macedonian church to take part in this in the first place? We'll jump ahead to chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. Look at this. It says, "For it's not necessary for me to write you about this service to the saints, because I know your eagerness to help. I keep boasting," that's Paul, keeps boasting to the Macedonians about the eagerness of yours, that Achaia has been ready to give since last year, and your zeal to participate has stirred up most of them. There's many reasons in life why we put items on pause. The text doesn't give us the reason here, but it does explain to us if we want to complete the task, if we want to finish what we started, how do we do this? And so let's look at these. Finish what you started. It starts with desire. They heard a need. They believed that they would be obedient and pleasing to God and meeting that need. And so that's why they started it. It was a desire. Paul told them about the opportunity of the saints in Jerusalem. They heard about it, and we feel called to do something about it. We have an ability to respond in faithfulness. And so there's a desire. Again, I want to please God with my life. I want to glorify God with my life. Again, I don't know how many times I hear someone say, I want to glorify God in my life. And then I look at their action, and it's like, that's not very God glorifying. So they started, but why didn't they finish? And so Paul's saying, if you want to be a finisher, yes, it starts with desire, but it can't end with desire. What's the next thing he tells us? That there's an eagerness. There's a sustained zeal. That's a devotion to God. It's the thing of, at your service, Lord, I am ready and willing to participate. Not just in thought, but thought and action. See, too often, disobedience happens when disciples want to know the completion or the results of the call before they give their willingness to serve. Right? I want to know the outcomes before I say, it's worth sacrificing my time, my money, my energy to this. And so many times it's like, well, what are the results going to be? God doesn't ask you for the results. He doesn't ask you to give the results. He asks you to serve. He asks you to give. He asks you to have genuine love. That's what he asks. And then as you do it, those results are up to God. They're not up to you. Yes. But too many times, we want to know the results before we say, I have the desire and I have the zeal to do it. And this is why disciples do not finish what they start at times. That they test for serving and pleasing the Lord with zeal. It's an eagerness to live for God, not for self. And so, again, we are called to leave the results up to God. Do you see what the text says? It says, according to your means. God's not asking you for what you don't have. He's asking you to be generous with what you do have. Yes. What has God graciously given to you? Notice, He's not asking you for all you have either. Because isn't that the fear at times? I would give more if I had more, but seeing how I don't have more, I'm not going to give. That misses the desire, that misses the zeal, and that misses the gracious act of what God has given to you. He's going to explain this more in the next point, in our next verses. He's not asking you for all you have. He's not going to put you into poverty. He's not saying you have to give more. No one would say, I'm going to take out a loan. I'm going to go down to Empower. I want to take out a loan so that I can give more to the church. That's not what God's saying here. He's not asking you for what you don't have. He's asking you to be gracious with what He's given to you. And so we have to ask, do I have a desire? Do I have a zeal for the Lord's work? Whether it's finances, whether it's time, whether it's service to God, all of them are a test of our love. Is it genuine or is it fake? Are we gracious or are we stingy? Are we generous? Are we holding back? Is it self-sacrificing or is it looking for others to serve me? What is your service to God? November and December here at CBC is our time of year where we go and we ask people to serve in various capacities at the church. We nominate, we talk about that, we say, here's the work that needs to be done here at this local church so that we might be obedient and faithful to God's work in this geography. And so we think about that. And you know what's lacking in our conversations? A call for the Lord. A zeal for the Lord. That Christ's church in this community might be that light that's shining bright for all to see. Do we really have a care and concern about how God looks through this local church expression in this community? If we do, we're going to say, at your service, Lord. I'm ready to serve. I'm not going to get caught up with the distractions in the world, of all these distractions that are around everywhere, but I'm going to finish what started. When you've joined this church, you said that you were going to be eager and devoted to the Lord, and that you're called to this local church body. I hear that all the time in our membership class. I hear that all the time in our membership testimonies. And then a year from now, and a year, or 2 years, or 3 years later, and it's like, I don't have time to serve. I don't have this to serve. I don't have that to serve. What's the problem? Desire and zeal. And so we look around here and we go, man, this is unfinished, this is unfinished. Why are these things all unfinished? Pastors, why don't we get these things finished? People are great at being consultants. They can see the needs that are around here. It's not the thought that counts. It's the thought and action. Are you ready to serve the Lord? Are you willing to serve the Lord? Are you going to get into the game? Because it's a test of love. You will stand before King Jesus one day.
Yes. Yes.
It's a test of love. And so I pray and long for zeal and desire for God's church to shine in this community. But you know what? As pastors, we can only counsel. We're not the bosses here. Christ's the boss. But at times, Pastor, I wish I could just command this person to do this. Or I wish I could just command this person to do this so that the job that was started, that was unfinished, would be finished. But we can't do that. We're not called to do that. I think people don't serve as they ought to because they think service is something more than what they have to offer. But go back to verse 12 here. He tells us what's acceptable service is. If eagerness, that's zeal, is present, the gift itself is acceptable. See, you can be pleasing to the Lord, guaranteed. if you give graciously of what God has given to you. It's not based upon the results. Leave the results up to God. Some planted, some water, but what? God gives the growth. And so let's not be concerned about the results. Let's be concerned about the test. Are you taking the test? Are you completing the test? Are you voluntarily and sacrificially giving and serving for God's kingdom? It's your attitude and your desire to serve the Lord that comes out of your heart, not the results. And so let's understand this test of love. Look at verses 13 through 15. Understanding the test of love. For I do not say so there would be relief for others and suffering for you, but as a matter of equality. At the present time your abundance will meet their need, so that one day their abundance may also meet your need. And thus there may be equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Paul is talking about God's provision to all of God's children, not just some of God's children. And too often in life, people only think about God's provision to themselves or to their family. But did you know part of being in God's family is that you're not only supposed to be concerned about yourself, but you're also supposed to be looking out for the interests of others. And so you should have a desire to see the whole family met, not just your family met.
Help us, Lord, yes.
Why? Because this is the character of God. Who are we imitating? Who are we attempting to please in our life? God gave. Through the grace of God, God became poor so others could be rich. Jesus left the comfort of his home, the presence of the Father, to come to earth so that we might have life. Is that the character and attitude that you display in your life? Remember, this text is talking about spiritual riches, being spiritually rich, and so this has an application in the physical realm. That's why Paul quotes Exodus 16:18 here. The one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Paul's reminding them about God's provision to all of Israel when they were in the wilderness. This is the manna passage, and how God provided to Israel. He provided manna for certain days of the week, and then he provided quail. And the miracle was not only the provision, get this, it wasn't only the provision of manna and the provision of quail, but also in the distribution of it. Some people were able to gather more because they were aged, they were young, they were strong, they were healthy. But others weren't able to gather as much. They were all called to gather, but they could not gather the same amount. But the text says that each had an omer no matter what they gathered. You see that in the text? Well, you have to go back to Exodus. An omer was a measurement that was supplied for the need of each person. So Paul's quoting the text from the wilderness. But here's the interesting thing. Paul does not quote the warning right after this passage. But I think for us, it's helpful because too many times we're individualistic in our thinking, rather community-oriented. And so listen, this is it right here. Exodus 16, verse 19 and 20. Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until the morning. Remember, you couldn't collect extra manna and then hoard it and store it overnight, because then what was going to happen? Well, it would turn into worms, full of worms, right? Verse 20. But they did not listen to Moses. Some kept part of it until morning, and it was full of worms and began to stink. And Moses was angry with them. And so here's the process. Whoever could gather more was supposed to gather more, but in that gathering more, there was a distribution so that everybody would have an omer. They would have what they needed to survive. There was no hoarding. There was communication and exhortation to share it with those who are unable to gather the omer. That's what the same thing we find in the disciples' prayer. You know, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. It drops down, what's it say about bread? It says, give us today our daily bread. Notice it doesn't say, give me my daily bread. It's not individualistic. It's community-focused. It's community-oriented. The prayer request for daily provision is corporate. And so, should we pray for the needs of others? Yes. But you know what would be better than just thought? Action. That not only would we pray that our neighbors would have daily bread, but if they didn't have daily bread, we would give them out of our abundance, out of what's been given to us, that we'd be gracious, that we'd be generous, that there'd be the miracle distribution, so that all in the community would have what they needed. No, we're not supposed to build greater storehouses for ourselves. We're to be gracious, generous, and sacrificial for the benefit of God's community. Give us our daily bread. It's not individualistic. It's community. I mean, isn't this what we saw in the early church in Acts? They were selling of items so that they could be giving to the church so that everyone had what? Need. Everyone had need. So we need to understand God's provision. God does not provide more for others to store it and hoard it, but to give it. Because that's who God is. That's God's character. He became poor so that we might become rich. Now, Pastor, now I hear this equality thing that he's saying in here. What's all that mean? Because I don't believe in economic socialism. I mean, you can't be preaching economic socialism here. It's not. This is not economic socialism. What does equality mean? Paul's quote of Exodus states, people will have differing gathering capacities. Economic socialism attempts to make everyone have the same gathering capabilities. The principle will never work because God didn't design it that way. Just because some people can gather more than others, however, doesn't make one more valuable than the other. Again, that's individualistic thinking. That it's all about me, myself, and my family instead of thinking about the whole group. And so yes, why do we do this? So that we can demonstrate God's character and love to those around us. I don't know about you, but when I get older, I hope that Christians are practicing this principle. Because I know as I get older, I'm not going to be able to gather my omer anymore. And I'm going to have to depend on someone else showing the grace of God towards me and giving me an omer. When we're young, we don't think about things like that. We think about building, growing, and building an empire. What about building God's empire? What about God's people? What about spiritual enrichment, not physical enrichment? See, we can't be thinking individually. Again, let's go back to 1 Corinthians 12. Paul's been teaching these principles. For just as the body is one, and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so too is Christ. For in one Spirit we're all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks or slaves or free, we were all made to drink of the one Spirit. For in fact, the body is not a single member, but many. Now he goes on to talk about the value of the ear, the eye, the foot, and so on. But look at verse 24. Instead, God has blended together the body, giving greater honor to the lesser member, so that there may be no division in the body, but the members may have mutual concern for one another. If one member suffers, everyone suffers with it. If a member is honored, all rejoice with it. And so God has purpose for everything that he does. Sure, he could have distributed his provisions to his children so that people would not have to give and share. Right? He could make so that everyone received one omer, if we carry out this analogy. Right? God could have done that. But he didn't. So it begs the question to ask why. And that is so that we might understand the grace of God. That we would understand that we are not independent of God. That we need God, and we need God's provisions and how God provides for the whole community. not just part of the community. Every day, we are taking God's test of love. This is not some hypothetical test. It's practical and everyday life. And the results demonstrate what we value. Do you love stuff? I think that's going to produce sorrow in your life if you love stuff. Do you love God? Do you love people? Well, then I think it's not only going to be in thought, but in action. And what that's going to produce in your life is spiritual enrichment. Or as John says, the abundant life. Do you want the abundant life? You might say that you want the abundant life, but do you have a zeal for the abundant life? An eagerness for the abundant life? You see, the church is called to be something different from the world. We get this. We understand why the world does this. We understand why they say, the one with the most toys wins. We get that. That's the world. But we're not the world. We're not the world. Grace has been shown to us in a way that the world has not seen.
Yes, yes.
That's why we come to the communion table. To celebrate the grace that God has given to us. And so individualism in the world is to be expected. But it's not supposed to be in the church. And my prayer is, may it never be. Now, as a pastor, I just want to commend our church in a couple places. I know this can be difficult. We can talk about these things, but I just want to take time to commend you folks. Think about the deacon's offering. What is that? Isn't that a grace offering? Isn't that where we're looking out for the needs of this family? And I must say, I am thankful for how this church body gives to the deacon fund so that anyone in need here has their need met. And so this church should be commended for that. You know what? As well, we don't have the church at Jerusalem, but I really much see the church in Nicaragua. I mean, I've seen both. We have much. The church in Nicaragua has little. But I've seen this church give to the church of Nicaragua. Not only in just money, but in sending resources. I don't know if you're going to call me a resource or not, I can understand, but going down there to help teach and help them develop counseling care for their body, you guys are concerned about that. And it's not just the church in Nicaragua. We have several other folks that we support missionary-wise. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that's where this church is being faithful in the call. But I think there's also some things that are unfinished here. I think there are some items that we can step up. And so that's my plea to you this day, is to think about your test of genuine love. Are you taking it? Are you completing it? Do you understand it? You don't say like, well, God's just going to take everything away from me and so I'm going to live poor. That's not what the text says. He says he's not going to put you into poverty. Don't be dramatic about it. But be voluntary, be sacrificial, be generous in your giving. We're the top 90%, right? As far as finances in the world. You can't say that we don't have that much. We have much. And so God's going to test us on that much that he's given to us to see if there's genuine love and giving that in a way that reflects his character. That's what the test is about. It's not about money. No, the church doesn't need your finances. No, God doesn't need your finances. He wants to get to the heart of the matter. Do you love him?